what you can do. Let us lay some funk on you.
Funk. Funk is a sensation, a universal feeling from another dimension. Funk's that thump in your chest that just makes you want to get on up and dance.
Funk is all about rhythm.
This affects your movements. It affects your speech. It affects the way that you dress.
Funk, in its essence, makes you dance, makes you move.
Some kind of tribal feeling or tribal message just makes people want to dance from the core of their heart.
Definition of funk, warm, damp place that gives life.
Funk's a state of mind. It's the sound of rebellion, a celebration of being black.
What's interesting about funk is that it was ours. It actually brought us together.
You know what funk music is? It's unapologetic blackness.
Ow! Get up off of that thing and dance to you.
Funk spread the groove around the world. Without it, much of the music we love today would never have happened.
There probably would not be any hip-hop without funk music. That's all a funk attitude. You know, I'm a player, I'm a hustler. That's all the stuff that George Clinton and those folks were doing in the 1970s. It's just called hip-hop today.
So, as we're standing on the verge of getting it on, let's take it to the stage and discover the story of how in the 1970s, America was one nation under a groove.
One nation under a groove. Getting down just for the funk of it.
By the mid-1970s, Black America had gone totally funky. The groove was in full effect. But just a decade earlier, it was another story. In the 1960s, it was hard just to be black. There was prejudice, discrimination, and segregation. The only music made by African Americans that filtered through to the charts was the vanilla pop of labels like Motown Records. So in the early 1960s, the funk was a mere glint in Mother Nature's eye. But one soul artist worked out a way to start the evolution. James Brown began his career back in the 1950s as an R&B singer. By the mid-60s, he'd become so influential and famous in black music, he was nicknamed the Godfather of Soul. But in 1967, James Brown left soul music behind. With one song called Cold Sweat, he showed the world the future, and that future was funk.
Cold Sweat was the song that just blew me away. That groove, it was different from earlier James Brown. Something happened.
I think the thing that happens with Cold Sweat is that that's where he really turned the whole band into a drum. You know, so every element in there is just kicking.
That was it. When they put that break in that record, yeah, and the horns, everything, the bass, Bootsy, the whole thing.
Yeah, that whole line was, I don't care, man.
Yeah. About your past. There was more emphasis on the bass and drum locking. It became harder. It was more intense with less.
James Brown surrounded himself with the best musicians money could buy. But it was him alone who decided what was funky. He'd get the band members to jam together, and then one by one, he'd get each of them to play what he was hearing in his head.
You had to really try to understand what he was talking about. You know, he would say things like do 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 do, and it wouldn't really be anything, you know. But a bass player could try to think something like what he do, and he said, no, that's not it. Then they do something else. He said, no, that's not. Then they do, he said, that's it, that's it. And when he said that's it, you just kept what you were doing.
Everybody hit it! Come on now! Good God!
Previously, with rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and soul music, the emphasis had been on the second and fourth beats of the bar. What James Brown did was to stress the first beat. This became the bedrock of funk music, the rhythm of the one.
There was that emphasis on boom, God, boom, God, boom. You know, his drum beats. Yeah.
James really conceived of the entire band as bringing these strong rhythmic accents, emphasizing that first beat again and again and again.
I mean, you know, every beat is there, but there's always an accent on the one, which is very African, you know, from way back in Africa. That was that rhythm that would just, you know, stir the soul, as it were.
All of a sudden, groove was more important, whereas in years past, the middle part was very important, and the vocal. Because remember, James wasn't doing a lot of lyrical, melodic vocals. He was, hi, good God, because he was just basically riding and dancing on top of that groove.
It not only kind of changed the way listeners thought about, you know, what dance music was, what funky music was, but a lot of songwriters and musicians, a lot of his peers.
All that we know, all that we do, James is the father. You know, they ain't called him Godfather for nothing. He was the man that taught us all how to be funky.
James Brown was funk's original pioneer, his Cold Sweat showing the path of the revolution. But the funk was not yet fully formed. Over on the west coast of America, from the heart of San Francisco's peace and love generation, emerged a new funk phenomenon. Amongst the psychedelic rock scenes of bands like Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead, this pioneering group was about to change the groove again.
Hey, here's Sly and the Family Stone.
Where James Brown's funk was strictly controlled by the Soul Brother #1 himself, in Sly and the Family Stone, everyone got involved with creating the vibe. Although they were a multiracial mixed-gender group, they had a sense of togetherness that really shone through in their music.
A lot of bands back during that time, they would have the singing group out front, and the band would be the backing band. But we were self-contained in that we were the band, and we were the singers as well. And we would all contribute to the lead lines. Sly would sing a line, I would sing a line, usually always the low, I'm gonna add some bottom. We all had our own musical background and experiences that we were allowed to contribute to the band. So everybody brought something to the table.
You might like to hear my organ. I said,
Although Sly was the writer, musically he would allow us to express ourselves. And I think that that really helped the band to be kind of like a melting pot of music, so to speak.
It was this openness to new ideas that allowed Larry Graham to go wild with his bass. He invented a new style of playing that would become one of the sounds most associated with funk. Slap bass. It was a technique he developed playing with his mum as a kid.
My mom decided that we weren't going to have drums anymore. Now, I don't know if that was for economic reasons or what. Maybe two people could make more than divided it up among three. She never told me the reason, but we're not going to have drums anymore. So that's when I started thumping the strings with my thumb to make up for not having that bass drum, and plucking the strings with my finger to make up for not having that backbeat on the snare drum. So it's kind of playing the drums on the bass.
Mama so happy, I start to cry.
After Thank You for Letting Me, that became a huge template for every bass player to start using the thumb slap.
You talk about a song being written around a bass riff, that was it.
Later on, other bands, if you were going to play some serious funk, you kind of had to have the bass player play my style of playing the bass.
Thank You was a #1 record that became a cornerstone of the funk. The way the bass riff left space for the rest of the band to fill in the groove showed the next generation of Funketeers how to construct a hit song out of a jam.
The more space sometimes that you leave between the 2 and the 4, and if you just play that continuously and let it just brew on the same groove over and over and over and over again until it gets so powerful, that is ridiculous. That's like the kind of funk that I like. And then you make the ugly face. Like, that's funky.
Everybody helped create the sound of the band, but Sly was very much the head of the family. He wrote the songs, the lyrics, and even told them what to wear. Their freaky clothes and afros would define the funk look of the 1970s.
They came as a unit. They were dressed as a unit. They wore the funkiest clothes. Oh my God. Bell bottoms, platform shoes, hats, jackets with fur on the side. It was almost like being in a dressed up gang.
He didn't like what I wore when I came to his house one day. So he looked down on the ground and he had a cowskin rug down there. He goes, "Give me a razor." And the guy raised me, went, cut a slit in the cowskin. I put it on as a poncho, and that was my outfit. I didn't choose that. That was hot and sweaty. But after that, I paid attention.
It wasn't just the band's clothes that made them stand out. Back in the late 1960s, a mixed-race group with a black lead singer was rare. Just performing on live television was making a statement to the whole of America. An integrated society could work. But for Sly and the Family Stone, it was just about talented musicians making incredibly funky music.
We just felt like a family, you know. I didn't really look at Greg Errico or Jerry Martini as, you know, the white members of the band, or I'm sure they weren't looking at us as the black members of the band. And so the crowds that we played for, they looked at us like that, and we looked at them like that.
Watchmen. But not everybody shared the same views. For black Americans, the 1960s was a daily fight for racial equality. There was widespread rioting and violent clashes with authorities.
It was rough, you know. We had gotten used to being looked upon as second class, you know, and not deserving first class treatment. And that's a bad thing. When people get used to being downtrodden and stepped on, that's a real bad thing.
James Brown believed he could help make a change. Thanks to some big funky hits in the second half of the 60s, he was a national superstar. And while he toured America, he used his fame to talk to local black communities, inspiring them to succeed in a white-run world.
When you go to get a job, don't go just to get a good job. Go with saying, one of these days I'll probably own this company, be the general manager, or build one of my own.
Look at me!
Brown believed money was the only way for black people to have any real power.
He felt that the secret to the success of the black community hinged on being self-supportive and not just depending on government support or having to work for the white man.
As the 1960s drew to a close, James became part of a growing group of black leaders forcing America to wake up to the civil rights movement.
We're gonna walk on this nation, we're gonna walk on this racist power structure, and we're gonna say to the whole damn government, stick 'em up, motherfucker. This is a hold-up. We come for what's ours.
But in April of 1968, this political push was stopped dead in its tracks. Dr. Martin Luther King, the movement's figurehead, was murdered.
When Martin Luther King was assassinated, you look and you go, where are, you know, our heroes are being wiped out one by one. What can we do? It's just when we, you know, we're getting someplace, we get knocked back down again.
Riots raged across America, and as one of the nation's most prominent black figures, pressure was on James Brown to respond.
James was pretty much the guy, you know, back then in the late 60s. There was pretty much nobody else that was as powerful and as strong as James was, his voice and his music, and people listened to him.
James's answer was to unite African Americans the best way he knew how, through the funk. In 1968, he released one of pop music's most influential cultural anthems, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. The single peaked at number 10 on the national charts. Funk music was carrying a message of black empowerment directly into mainstream America.
The lyrics, everything were right on. It was perfect, you know. It instilled pride in us, you know. It instilled a sense of purpose, so we can go further in life if we wanted to, and not to be ashamed of the fact that you were black, because at that time everybody was telling you were ashamed. You would, you know, to be ashamed of yourself, or you'll never be nothing.
When he played it live in Jersey City, Roosevelt Stadium, and it had about 30,000 or 40,000. And everybody said, I'm black and I'm proud.
Say it loud.
Say it loud.
In fact, they had to stop the concert.
Yeah.
Because we got excited, you know. We want to tear something up now.
The first time he played it live was in Houston, Texas. I'll never forget it. And James came on stage and he said, say it loud. And the whole audience, I tear up when I say this. I'm black and I'm proud, you know. It was amazing. Amazing. The whole audience said it. Must have been 20,000, 30,000 people there. And they all said, I'm black and I'm proud.
While James Brown's funky protest anthem plugged right into the heart of black America, Sly Stone was writing some anthems of his own.
We got to live together. I am no better, neither are you. We are the same, whatever we do.
He was the Family Stone's creative genius, and whereas James Brown's lyrics were often about black pride, Sly's message was about bringing people together.
important than anything to me, because he was naturally funky, and everybody in the band was funky, even me. But his lyrics were the most important things that he ever did. He's so brilliant. I mean, even songs like Stand, if you listen to Stand, it was about the times.
Stand for the things you know are right. It's the truth that the truth makes me so alive. Stand.
There was no talk about violence. It doesn't talk about get your weapons and, you know, stand up against something. You know what I'm saying? It's just stand for it.
Sly and the Family Stone's sing-along songs and hippie attitude appeal to both black and white record buyers. By the time the band played Woodstock Festival, they already had 2 huge #1 singles. If they could go down well in front of 500,000 rock fans, the funk would truly have crossed over. But arriving on stage at 3 a.m., they had their work cut out.
About 3 or 4 songs into our set, people started getting into it and coming out of their tents because it had been raining, you know. It was amazing. But the energy coming from the audience, that, you know, so it was this whole thing that was driving. They were driving us, we were driving them, and it was like a snowball effect, you know. It was pretty powerful.
The roar of 500,000 people going, yeah! I mean, that was something that we had never heard before or felt before, that kind of energy.
Wanna take the higher. Wanna take the higher. Wanna take the higher.
It was just a turning point for us to be seen by that many people, for it to be written about by as many writers as wrote about the Woodstock event. It just changed the lives of a lot of entertainers.
Both Sly Stone and James Brown had engineered the genetic makeup of funk. By the early 1970s, it became infectious, and soon the funk DNA was spreading all around the world, spawning a wave of new music.
There's just funk everywhere. It became the music of young people.
Funk had become the new hot music in the black community and amongst dance music fans. It was the new shit.
Ohio players, the Commodores, Kool and the Gang, Tower of Power. Funk was everywhere. Everyone had a band. Everybody wanted to make music that was funky. You had Soul Train, you had Soul, you know, which were national TV shows that represented black music, black culture. So people were actually having it being brought into their living room.
See I'm walking, see how I'm talking, mama. Notice everything in me. Just put your hand in mine. You love me all the time. The truth you were plain, let's see. So come on and feel it.
Even if you look at the Jackson 5, at a certain point they broke away from the Motown model they were given, and they made Dancing Machine, which was definitely funk influenced as well, because they wanted to make music that was funkier, because that was all around them.
The Jackson 5 weren't the only act from the Motown family to embrace the music. Although the Detroit record label was initially reluctant to let its stars join the party, the only ones who would survive into the 1970s were those who could keep up with the funk. Little Stevie Wonder grew up from a child pop star into a fully grown songwriter with a run of albums that featured some seriously funky cuts.
There is superstition.
wall. There is superstition. Let us start to fall.
And it wasn't long before British bands got their funk on too. Having begun their careers nicking riffs from African-American blues artists, English rock bands like the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin borrowed a few funk ones too, working a couple of tracks onto their multi-million selling albums.
He sure is a good friend. I ain't gonna tell you where he comes from.
But it was a Scottish band who had the funkiest sound in 1970s Britain. Average White Band started out as a covers group obsessed with James Brown's funk records. They honed their chops on the London live circuit and then put out their own monster slice of funk called Picking Up the Pieces. It topped the American charts. The record sounded so authentic, there were a few surprises when the band took to the road.
A lot of audiences assumed we were black because they'd heard the record on the radio, and they'd turn up and it was like, come on,
Yeah.
And then as soon as we started to play, it was like, ah, okay.
They were so funky, even James Brown and his band came to one of their shows to check out white funk in action.
He said, yeah, you guys, I like you guys' groove. You know, it's ultimate compliment. Yeah. So, of course, we went to the bar after that and we got hanging with some of the guys and they were saying, man, when your record came out, when Pick Up the Pieces came out, you guys were really, everyone was coming up to say, hey, man, we love your new record. And they going, hey, Nuz. Hey, Nuz is some Scottish band from Scotland.
Funk was taking over planet Earth. But another funketeer was already orbiting our atmosphere who would take the music into another dimension. Armed with laser-guided melodies, atomic grooves, and rhythmic devastation, this intergalactic funkonaut came from another planet. His name was George Clinton. By the end of the 1970s, Clinton had built a musical empire that turned funk into a way of life. It all began back in the 1950s when George Clinton led a barbershop singing group called the Parliaments.
I remember them as being a stand-up group wearing powder blue suits, like the Temptations. And they had a song called I Just Want to Testify.
Don't you know that I just want to testify what your love has done for me?
But suits and smart haircuts wasn't George Clinton's thing. He had the funk inside of him, and it just had to burst out.
From there, things really start to kind of unravel, because as George has said, they really just could not keep it smooth, keep it together like those Motown acts. He said, yeah, we just sweated too much. Guys started ripping off their, their shirts, and, choreography got messed up.
George walks in when he got this mohawk, hair, cut his hair down here, and he got color over here, and they said, "What's up, George?" Man, I'm taking this thing in another direction.
Free your mind. Your ass will follow. The kingdom of heaven is within.
George's plan was to find a new platform for the funk. Although rock had developed out of the blues and R&B created by African Americans, apart from Jimi Hendrix, there were virtually no black rock artists. So in 1969, George Clinton set out to change that. He took the funk and married it with psychedelic rock. He called it Funkadelic, and that's exactly what it was, acid rock with a huge dose of funk.
We were late, so we had to catch up with the psychedelic.
So, of course, we just turned everything up, had all the marshals in the world, went in the studio and did Free Your Mind, Your Ass Will Follow, all in one day, tripping our ass, one acid.
Those first 4 or 5 Funkadelic records are the most esoteric, bizarre, experimental takes on what R&B could be imaginable, you know? I mean, because they're full of parody and they're full of satire, but then they're full of like this amazing musicianship, you know? So it's not just guys kind of, taking the piss out of the R&B tradition and the discipline of that, but guys who actually know that discipline, kind of know all the rules, and they know how to, just completely abstract and demolish them.
Although cult hits, Funkadelic's acid-drenched funk rock albums of the early 70s barely made the top 100. Their experimental sound too challenging for both white and black audiences. But George Clinton was already moving on.
When everybody thinks they have them pegged, really, as these LSD tripping, half-naked performing, funk circus, they revive Parliament. But this time as just this amazingly spectacular, theatrical, dance-oriented act, And George keeps some of the kind of conceptual headroom of Funkadelic in the thing, but it's really masked by the beats.
George wanted Parliament to be the group that got his funk into the pop charts. He looked to James Brown's band for help. Bass player Bootsy Collins, his guitarist brother Catfish, and most of the horn section were tired of Brown's control freakery. They jumped ship to join Parliament, bringing with them Brown's theory of keeping it on the one. But with George, they could go as wild and as funky as they wanted.
James Brown wanted just like this, just like that, just like he said. That everything had to be just like he said, But George Clinton would take anything that you did initially, but he would either mix it out or mix it in. He would choose whether to use it or not, I did some stuff that was so crazy. George said, "Did you mean that?" And I said, "Yes, I meant that," And he would use it.
It was freedom. You could do whatever you wanted. You can make any kind of music that was in your heart, that you could imagine you can do. There were no rules.
With George Clinton in charge, it was pure creative freedom, whether in the studio or on stage. From the mid-1970s onwards, Clinton joined Parliament and Funkadelic into one big touring circus. He called the whole thing P-Funk and turned the concerts into total theater.
P-Funk shows were like going to the circus. It had everything. It was just like watching images like this, like, what's going on?
Do y'all wanna fly this evening? Do you wanna ride on the mothership? No.
First of all, it's this little tiny spaceship coming from the back of the hall all the way to the front. And then the mothership just comes down. And then George comes up out of the floor. It was incredible.
It was one continuous song. It never stopped. I think they would have to pull the plug to tell them to get off stage. They played for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time. and just keep playing until it's like, okay, cut, we got to turn the lights off.
There could be over 30 musicians on stage, but they all knew how to play together, keeping it all on the rhythm of the one. The funk had become a spiritual experience.
It's that tribal thing, and what it is, it's like listening to a heartbeat. Everyone listening to the same heartbeat. Boom, boom, ba-ba, boom, 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 ba-ba. You start hearing that, and you get the people feeling more tribal. And then when you become tribal, it brings together unity to the music.
It was this sense of unity that was bringing thousands of Black P-Funk fans together at huge concerts all over America. This was the first time a Black act had rivaled the big live shows of the 1970s white rock bands. And for many African-American teenagers, this was their stadium rock experience.
P-Funk always had a humongous Black audience, so they were playing sold-out stadiums full of Black people. Like if you went to a P-Funk concert in D.C., you know, as I did, like in the 70s, like, you never saw any white people there.
And it was Black America buying the records, taking monster P-Funk jams like One Nation Under a Groove and Flashlight to the top of the R&B charts. As the money started rolling in, George Clinton turned P-Funk into an empire.
I figured the best way to keep the dream alive is to get as many deals as you could. One group, you had one chance to make it. Two groups, you got two chances. But Bootsy made it three. Then I realized everybody around you wants to be a star, and we all helped each other. We were the same people on everybody's record. Just another person got out front. We did it with the Brides, the Parlette, Bootsy, Fred Western, them, the Horny Horns, Eddie Hazel, Bernie Worrell. We did everything. We recorded the roadies, because most roadies are musicians too.
Well, all right. Start ya.
At the height of its success, there were nearly 100 musicians in the P-Funk gang. It may have seemed like a crazy army of funk, but just like James Brown and Sly Stone, there was meaning behind the music.
They were very serious about their message. Their whole vibe was Black and about Black empowerment, you know, in different ways. And so I think that people who don't understand that don't really understand funk music, don't understand P-Funk.
Our thing was to make you think. We say stuff off the wall where you have to ponder it and figure out what the hell is he talking about. Might not be talking about nothing, but it was a good way to lead you into thinking. And when you tell somebody no, you really turn them on to thinking. So we would do a lot of things that we know people was gonna say, no, don't do that. You know, like, if you would suck my soul, I would lick your funky emotion.
If you will suck my soul, I will lick your funky emotions.
You don't know why, but that just don't sound like something you were supposed to say. You know, and that makes you think, what are they saying?
What's happening, CC? They still call it the White House, but that's a temporary condition too. Can you dig it, CC?
The P-Funk philosophy inspired Black people to believe in themselves and told them they could achieve the unachievable in 1970s America.
We had to get a lot of our Black people up off our knees who were thinking they couldn't do these things and was ashamed of being Black, ashamed of being a Negro, ashamed of being everything. Didn't know what they wanted to be called because it was built into you to be ashamed of yourself.
You're told your options are limited. You're told not to think about a life beyond the givens, you know, and here these guys come saying, you can be astronauts, you can be aliens, you can be ancient Egyptian mad scientists.
When they talk about Black folks being in outer space, you know, we didn't think Black folks could go in outer space unless we were smoking weed or something like that. And so they were saying, no, you can actually do this.
Parliament Funkadelic, George Clinton, I mean, they're liberators of the Black imagination, you know, in 20th century America. That's the revolution they kind of fought and won.
But funk's power to free the Black imagination was reaching outside of the music business too. In the 1970s, a wave of action films were produced by Black people for Black people. Now known as blaxploitation films, they were often cartoon and sometimes controversial characterizations of African American life. or spoofs of classic Hollywood movies.
Blackula.
But they all drew from 1970s black culture, the fashion, the language, and of course the music.
Every movie had a funky soundtrack.
You were getting these artists who had an opportunity to score movies.
Ain't I clean, bad machine, super cool, super mean, feeling good for the man, super fly, here I stand, secret stand.
The music made the film, and the film made the music.
I'm your pusher man.
Blaxploitation movies gave African-American actors the opportunity to star in leading roles, something 1970s Hollywood was denying them.
Okay, Tom, used up your minutes. Get out. Don't tell me, man.
With funk music very much in the foreground of the movie soundtracks, the films had an unapologetically black swagger, a feeling that was directly taken from the funk.
I can't tell you how it was empowering it was for us to see ourselves on screen that way. And it was literally people that we saw in our community with the big afros, you know, with the colorful shirts, with the medallions, necklaces.
They were walking like you walk when you're walking down 63rd Street. They didn't just walk, they swaggered down. They had style. They were wearing the clothes, the kind of clothes that you were wearing.
It was just a wonderful time for a lot of actors that couldn't buy a part to play in a movie. And I just felt that was fantastic that our people got to work. A lot of our people got a chance to get a payday.
Funk music was at the center of a cultural shift where for the first time African Americans were able to proudly display their blackness. They no longer had to deny their African heritage and were empowered to explore a history the American education system had willfully ignored.
It was necessary for us to recognize our identity because it was taken away from us for so long and denied us for so long and suppressed. It was necessary for us to have that reinforced.
A lot of people became more aware of, you know, our background, where we came from, and I think that they were very proud of where us and a lot of our ancestors came from, and the strength that it took to endure a lot of the things that had to be endured just to survive. And it started to be expressed musically, but also in fashion as well.
Beautiful people know true beauty is natural.
Wear their naturals proudly.
Wear their naturals proudly.
As a symbol of pride and blackness.
As a symbol of pride and blackness.
Funk was at the forefront of this new wave of black pride, with many musicians adopting African imagery. When Kool and the Gang looked back to Africa, it gave them their first big hit records. They took spiritual and rhythmic themes from African artists like Manu Dibango and transformed them into funk.
Our producer at that time, Gene Red, said, you know, I want you to record Soul Makusa. They said, we don't really need to make a copy, you know, because we felt that our music was creative enough. So we make up our own Soul Makusa. So we went in the studio, we made it up in the morning, right, at Baggies. Funky stuff, Hollywood swing and jungle boogie. So we stumbled upon our first gold records by not doing Soul Makusa. So we said, oh, we make our own jungle music. Jungle boogie, jungle boogie, get it on. Jungle boogie, jungle boogie, get it on. Jungle boogie.
Kool and the Gang were just one of many funk groups who were all over the charts in the 1970s.
Shake it around.
But emerging from the scene was one band that would eclipse them all. In the second half of the 1970s, Earth, Wind & Fire beamed their precision funk into the homes of millions. Started by funky drummer Maurice White, this 9-piece band brought with them a meticulous level of musicianship that made funk more popular than ever.
Shining star, no matter who you are, shining bright to see.
same elements in terms of gospel, funk, jazz, soul. All of that was in their music in the same way it was in George Clinton's music. It's just it was more polished.
Do you believe in love this evening? Do you believe that love was written in the stone?
George Clinton's music was a harder sounding funk. The long jams, psychedelic freakouts, and lyrical in-jokes could sometimes alienate audiences. Earth, Wind & Fire was a lighter style, using the rhythms and grooves to make catchy pop songs with a universal appeal.
I found a love provides a key, unlocks the heart and souls of you and me.
There were people for whom Funkadelic was just too weird. Earth, Wind & Fire, their agenda was definitely more to make a black sound that also kind of reached into mainstream middle America as well.
Earth, Wind & Fire's Funk Light was not just more appealing to whites, but also to the black middle classes, whose numbers were significantly rising in the late 1970s. Moving into white areas, these newly affluent African Americans were keen to portray an image of black sophistication that Earth, Wind & Fire represented.
The music is in some ways is kind of leading that charge, you know, of Black America, certain segments of Black America being able to kind of move out of the hood and into these areas with nicer homes, nicer schools, nicer lawns. So there's a sociological parallel.
It was a new audience for the funk, and they bought Earth, Wind & Fire's records in their millions. In the late 1970s, the group scored 5 top 10 albums, selling out huge stadiums all over America. They were one of the biggest bands on the planet, and the funk was at the height of its powers. Earth, Wind & Fire's phenomenal record sales allowed them to take P-Funk's live show concepts to the next level. While they belted out their perfectionist funk, they stunned their audiences with extravagant costumes, choreographed dances, and elaborate magic tricks. This may have been the funk at its most commercial, but at the end of the 70s, it was the greatest show on earth.
One of Maurice's visions, which was brilliant, was that as well as having a well-honed and toned band musically, let's give the people a feast for their eyes as well as their ears.
We were kind of in the Egyptology thing at the time, and we, you know, the pyramids and the Sphinx and all that, it was part of our persona, part of our show. People thought we could levitate. People thought we could, you know, do our hands and do things that were, I mean, they really thought we were magicians after a while.
They were doing tricks, they were disappearing. The drums were moving, they were moving in different elements on stage. It was crazy. It was like a magic show / fashion show. A dance-off. I mean, I was exhausted. I felt like I had performed. I was so busy screaming and yelling, "Ah, I love that song, ah!" You know?
But just as it seemed the funk was fully evolved, a rival groove was working its way into our atmosphere. Once it broke through, it would take over our entire planet. The funk was under serious threat.
Shake, shake, shake. Shake, shake, shake. Shake your booty. Shake your booty.
When disco came in, things started changing almost overnight. And it was unfortunate for a lot of those funk acts because it just sort of killed them dead in their tracks.
Disco was so big, they was having them in grocery stores at night funeral parlors moved the caskets out the way, turned it into a disco. They was in demand.
Although disco retained elements of the funk, something vital was missing. Funk's heartbeat, the rhythm of the one, had gone up in smoke.
The beat went to 4 on the floor. It became boom, 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 boom. There was no syncopation, so you just had this boom, 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 boom. And funk is boom, tack, tick, tack, boom. It's a syncopated beat. So the beat went to boom, boom, boom.
In the club, I guess disco was easier to dance off of. It was a straight beat.
But one beat, to do everything with that beat, it's like making love with the same stroke, one stroke. We get on your nerves so bad you won't be able to come. It's like not being able to come.
The natural rhythms of funk that made it so human were being replaced by the computerized precision of electronic instruments.
I remember having conversations with many drummers and percussion players to say, oh my God, you know, what's going to happen? Are we going to have a job anymore? Are we going to be able to play? Who's going to hire us? Because now it's all about drum machine technology.
The funk had to adapt to survive. Earth, Wind & Fire tackled disco head-on by switching their groove and punching into the charts with one of their biggest hit records. Many of the 70s bands were posed with a dilemma. Get down with the disco beat or stay true to the funk and lose your record deal.
The reality is Maurice didn't want to do Boogie Wonderland. And Verdine and I said, we should do it. But when it started shooting up the charts, Maurice was like, yeah. You know? So, I mean, there's a slippery slope you have to walk between so-called staying current and staying true to what got you current.
Other funk bands realized it was time to change too. Kool and the Gang, formerly an instrumental group, introduced a singer, adapted the beat, and enjoyed the most successful hits of their career.
Ladies' Night wasn't straight up disco. Ladies' Night was dance because you still heard the Kool and the Gang style with them horns.
Yeah.
And where the groove was.
Watered down, of course, but
yeah. It's so.
But our diehard punk fans, they didn't.
They were still there,
like
yeah.
that. They hated it.
No, they said, oh, Kool and the Gang sold out.
They sold out.
They crossed over. They doing songs like Joanna.
We did. We sold out of every record in the store.
We could sell. The record company didn't have no problem with that.
No, no problem with that.
But the original pioneers struggled to survive as disco took over. James Brown, once such an innovator of black music, was now playing catch-up, his new watered-down sound failing to sell. By the end of the 1970s, Sly and the Family Stone had disbanded, with Sly practically disappearing from public life due to a serious drug problem. And as the clubs and dance floors of America were getting down to that 4 to the floor, George Clinton's empire was in tatters as he battled record label disputes and the spiraling costs of running his army of P-Funk musicians. With a new decade on the horizon, how could the funk continue? The answer, once again, came straight out of the African-American community. Just like funk, this new music form was a direct reflection of black life. They called it hip-hop, and thanks to sampling technology, at its heart was funk.
There probably would not be any hip-hop without funk music. James Brown, the most sampled artist in music history, pioneer of funk music. Parliament, Funkadelic, George Clinton, second most sampled artist in pop music history, foundation for hip hop.
While hip-hop raided funk's back catalogue, other graduates of the 1970s school of funk were keeping the groove alive. A wave of 1980s bands used digital production to keep funk relevant for the next generation. As did one man from Minnesota, who spent his childhood worshipping at the church of Brown, Stone, and Clinton. Prince began his career in funk, but by the mid-1980s, he'd moved on to rock, pop, and whatever else tickled his purple fancy. He made himself into a superstar in the process, but that irresistible groove has always underpinned his music.
Let's rock. Let's roll.
His recent record's a celebration of his funk roots. The last 20 years have seen the beats, breaks, and bass lines of funk embedded into popular music. As George Clinton would say, it's in the DNA.
Blurred Lines, the big hit by Robin Thicke that was produced by Pharrell, in the last year or so. That's multiple rhythms, that's funk music, man. What Pharrell Williams is doing, that's all funk music. Daft Punk, definitely a funk album.
Lose yourself to dance. Lose yourself to dance. Lose yourself to dance.
While the funk continues to mutate and survive in the 21st century, the original Funketeers who pioneered this music in the 1970s are still keeping the groove alive today.
When you look at the black music that's booked and appears all over the world, Larry Graham in China, it's a huge funk market in Japan. This music has become an international language.
George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic are still out on the road doing their thing. Bootsy's still doing his thing. Fred, Wesley, Mazio, all of these veterans are still out here keeping it alive.
Funk will never die. Funk will be here forever because as long as there are things like oppression and discrimination and people feeling marginalized, there's always going to be a need for people to create some sort of multi-rhythm music that's so different than anything that you will ever hear on the radio. That's funk music.